Picture this. You're standing in a dusty courthouse in 1885 New Mexico, believing you're about to inherit everything your grandfather built with his bare hands. The lawyer opens the will, and suddenly, 7 women you've never seen before step forward, each claiming a piece of your legacy. What would you do? Today, I'm going to tell you the incredible true story of Caleb Morgan, a young farmer whose world was turned upside down in ways he never could have imagined. Before we dive into this gripping tale, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss the shocking twists that are coming. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Morgan ranch as 24-year-old Caleb Morgan stood on the weathered porch, surveying the vast expanse of land that stretched toward the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The New Mexico Territory in 1885 was unforgiving, a place where only the strongest survived, and where every acre of fertile land was worth more than gold. 3 weeks had passed since his grandfather, Ezekiel Morgan, had been laid to rest in the small cemetery overlooking the valley. The old man had been a legend in these parts, arriving in 1847 with nothing but a wagon, a rifle, and an iron will that had carved this ranch from the wilderness. Now, at 78, he was gone, leaving behind a legacy that Caleb believed was his alone to carry. Caleb, called Maria Santos, the ranch's cook and the closest thing to family he'd known since his parents died of fever when he was 12. You need to eat something before heading to town. He turned to see the weathered Mexican woman standing in the doorway, her dark eyes filled with the same concern she'd shown him for over a decade. Maria had worked for his grandfather since before Caleb was born, and her loyalty to the Morgan family was absolute. "I'm not hungry, Maria," Caleb replied, adjusting his worn leather hat. "Just want to get this business with the lawyer finished so we can move forward." The reading of Ezekiel's will was scheduled for 10 o'clock at the courthouse in Santa Fe, a 2-hour ride through terrain that could be treacherous even for experienced horsemen. Caleb had made the journey countless times, but today felt different. Today, he would officially become the sole owner of the largest ranch in the territory. "Your grandfather was a complicated man," Maria said, stepping onto the porch. "There are things about his past that even I don't know. Be prepared for surprises, Mijo." Caleb frowned. "What kind of surprises?" "Grandfather told me everything about the ranch, about the business. I've been running most of it for the past 5 years anyway." Before he could ask more questions, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. 3 riders emerged from the morning haze, ranch hands returning from checking the northern pastures, where cattle had been mysteriously disappearing. "Boss," called out Jake Wheeler, the ranch foreman and Caleb's closest friend. "We found tracks near Devil's Canyon. Looks like rustlers hit us again last night. Took maybe 20 head." Caleb's jaw tightened. Cattle rustling had become increasingly common as more settlers moved into the territory, and the law was often too far away to be of any help. The ranch employed 12 men and supported dozens of families in the surrounding area, making every loss significant. The courthouse in Santa Fe was a modest adobe building that served as the center of legal affairs for the territory. Caleb arrived early, tying his horse Thunder to the hitching post and dusting off his best suit, a black wool outfit he'd worn to his grandfather's funeral. Inside, he found Jeremiah Blackwood, the elderly lawyer who'd handled the Morgan family's affairs for over 20 years. Blackwood was a thin, precise man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a reputation for absolute discretion. "Caleb, my boy," Blackwood said, rising from behind his desk, "I'm sorry for your loss. Ezekiel was a remarkable man." "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. I'm ready to proceed with the reading." The lawyer's expression grew uncomfortable. "Well, there's been a slight complication. It seems we'll need to wait for a few additional parties to arrive." "Additional parties?" Caleb's brow furrowed. "What additional parties?" "Grandfather's will concerns the ranch, and I'm his only heir." Blackwood cleared his throat nervously. That's what we need to determine today. Please have a seat. They should be arriving shortly." Before Caleb could respond, the courthouse door opened, and a woman entered. She was perhaps 30 years old, with auburn hair pinned elegantly beneath a traveling hat, and dressed in a fine blue dress that spoke of money and refinement. Her green eyes surveyed the room with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted. "Mr. Blackwood, she said in a cultured Eastern accent. "I'm Victoria Ashford. I believe you're expecting me." Caleb stood, confusion evident on his face. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I think there's been some mistake. This is a private family matter." Victoria's smile was cold as winter wind. "Oh, but it is a family matter, Mr. Morgan. You see, Ezekiel Morgan was my father." The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. "That's impossible. My grandfather never mentioned having any children besides my father." "There's quite a lot your grandfather never mentioned," Victoria replied, taking a seat across from him. "But I have documentation to prove my claim." Before anyone could respond, the door opened again, and 6 more women entered in succession. Each was different in age, appearance, and social standing, but all carried themselves with the same determined air as Victoria. The second woman was younger, perhaps 25, with dark hair and olive skin that suggested Spanish heritage. She wore a simple but well-made dress and introduced herself as Isabella Reyes. "Ezekiel Morgan promised my mother he would provide for me," she said in accented English. "I have his letters." The third was an older woman, maybe 45, with graying blonde hair and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. "Name's Sarah Mitchell," she said in a voice roughened by years of frontier life. "Ezekiel and I were close for several years in Colorado. He owes me." The fourth woman was striking, tall, with black hair and piercing blue eyes. She moved with the grace of someone comfortable with danger. "Catherine Wolfe," she said simply. "Half Lakota. Ezekiel saved my life once. I saved his twice. We have an understanding." The fifth was barely more than a girl, maybe 19, with blonde curls and nervous energy. I'm Emma Thompson," she stammered. "Ezekiel Morgan was my father. My mother died last month, and she told me to come here." The sixth woman was middle-aged, with brown hair streaked with silver and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Dr. Margaret Hayes," she announced. "I treated Ezekiel for various ailments over the years. He promised me compensation for my services." The seventh and final woman was perhaps the most mysterious of all. She appeared to be in her 30s, with raven black hair and dark eyes that seemed to see everything. She wore black from head to toe and spoke with a slight accent that Caleb couldn't place. "I am Natasha Volkov," she said. "Ezekiel Morgan owed me a debt that can only be repaid through his estate." Caleb looked around the room in stunned silence. 7 women, each claiming some connection to his grandfather, each apparently entitled to a portion of what he believed was his inheritance. "This is insane," he finally managed. "Mr. Blackwood, surely you can't take these claims seriously." The lawyer adjusted his spectacles nervously. "I'm afraid, Caleb, that your grandfather's will is quite specific. It states that his estate is to be divided among his legitimate heirs and those to whom he owes significant debts of honor. Each of these ladies has presented documentation supporting their claims." Victoria Ashford opened her purse and withdrew a bundle of papers: birth certificate, correspondence from Ezekiel acknowledging paternity, and a promissory note guaranteeing me a portion of his estate. One by one, the other women produced their own evidence: letters, photographs, legal documents, and personal items that seemed to authenticate their connections to Ezekiel Morgan. Caleb felt the world spinning around him. The ranch that had been his entire life, his future, his identity, was suddenly being claimed by strangers. How is this possible? I lived with him for 12 years. He never mentioned any of you." "Your grandfather was a man of many secrets," said Catherine Wolfe, her voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "He lived several lifetimes before settling on this ranch. We represent different chapters of his story." Blackwood cleared his throat. "According to the will, the estate must be settled within 30 days. During that time, all parties with legitimate claims must work together to determine the most equitable distribution of assets." "Work together?" Caleb's voice rose. "These women are strangers. I don't know anything about them, and they certainly don't know anything about running a ranch." "Then perhaps," said Isabella Reyes softly, "it's time we all got to know each other." As the morning sun climbed higher over Santa Fe, Caleb Morgan realized that his life had just become infinitely more complicated. The ranch he'd thought was his birthright was now the center of a complex web of claims and counterclaims, and the 7 women sitting in that courthouse held the power to change everything he'd ever known. The ride back to the ranch felt like the longest journey of Caleb's life. Behind him, in a procession of hired carriages and horses, came the 7 women who had just turned his world upside down. Blackwood had insisted that all parties remain at the ranch during the 30-day settlement period, arguing that they needed to understand the property's value and operations before making any decisions about its future. As they crested the hill overlooking the Morgan Ranch, Caleb heard several gasps of appreciation. The property was indeed impressive. Over 50,000 acres of prime grazing land, a main house that Ezekiel had expanded over the years into a sprawling adobe mansion, numerous outbuildings, corrals, and a bunkhouse that could accommodate 20 men. "It's beautiful," whispered Emma Thompson, the youngest of the group. "I never imagined it would be so grand." "Your grandfather built quite an empire," Victoria Ashford observed, her calculating eyes taking in every detail. "This must be worth a fortune." Caleb dismounted at the main house, where Maria Santos stood waiting on the porch. Her expression grew increasingly concerned as she watched the parade of women approaching. "Maria," Caleb called out, "we're going to have guests for a while. Can you prepare rooms for 7 ladies?" Maria's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. "7 ladies? Dios mío, what has happened?" "It's complicated," Caleb replied grimly. "I'll explain later." As the women settled into the house, Caleb found himself studying each of them more carefully. Victoria Ashford carried herself like aristocracy, examining the furnishings and artwork with the eye of someone accustomed to fine things. Isabella Reyes moved through the house quietly, touching surfaces gently, as if trying to connect with some memory of the man who had built it. Sarah Mitchell seemed most interested in the practical aspects of the ranch. She stood at the kitchen window, watching the cowboys work with the horses in the corral. "Good operation," she commented to Maria. "Your men know their business." Catherine Wolfe had positioned herself where she could observe everyone while remaining somewhat apart. Her eyes missed nothing, and Caleb got the impression that she was assessing not just the property, but the people as well. That evening, Maria prepared a dinner that could accommodate the unexpected crowd. As they gathered around the long dining table that Ezekiel had commissioned from craftsmen in Mexico City, an uncomfortable silence settled over the group. Finally, Victoria Ashford broke the tension. "I think we should be honest with each other about our situations. We're all here because of our connections to Ezekiel Morgan, but we're essentially strangers. If we're going to resolve this matter fairly, we need to understand each other's claims." "I'll start," said Dr. Hayes, setting down her fork. "I met Ezekiel 15 years ago when he came to Denver seeking treatment for a gunshot wound. Over the years, I treated him for various injuries and ailments. He always paid well, but 3 years ago, he asked me to perform a dangerous surgery on a friend of his, a man wanted by the law. I saved the man's life, but in doing so, I had to close my practice and leave Denver. Ezekiel promised to compensate me for my losses." Catherine Wolfe nodded approvingly. "Honorable debt." Ezekiel valued loyalty above all else. She paused, then continued. "My story begins 20 years ago. I was 16, traveling with my mother's people when we were attacked by soldiers. Ezekiel found me dying and nursed me back to health. Later, when he was trapped in a blizzard in the mountains, I found him and kept him alive for 6 days until help arrived. We became close. He promised that if anything happened to him, I would be provided for." Sarah Mitchell's story was more straightforward. "I ran a boarding house in Colorado mining country. Ezekiel stayed with me for 3 months while he was prospecting. We became partners in more ways than one. When he left, he promised to send for me, but he never did. I've been waiting 20 years for him to keep his word." Isabella Reyes spoke softly, her accent making her words sound almost musical. "My mother, Carmen, worked for Ezekiel when he first came to New Mexico. She was very young, very beautiful. They fell in love, but Ezekiel was already building his reputation, and a Mexican mistress would have hurt his standing with the territorial government. When she became pregnant with me, he sent her away with money and a promise that he would always provide for his child. He kept that promise until my mother died 6 months ago. Emma Thompson's voice shook as she told her story. My mother never told me who my father was until she was dying. She said she met Ezekiel in Kansas when she was traveling west with her first husband. Her husband died of cholera, and Ezekiel, he comforted her. When she realized she was pregnant, she was too ashamed to tell him. She married another man and raised me as his daughter. But she kept Ezekiel's letters, and she made me promise to find him. Victoria Ashford's tale was the most complex. My mother was Elizabeth Ashford, daughter of a Boston shipping family. She met Ezekiel in 1854 when he was in the East raising money for his ranch. They had a brief but passionate affair. When she discovered she was pregnant, her family disowned her. Ezekiel had already returned to New Mexico, and she was too proud to follow him. She raised me alone, but she never stopped loving him. When she died last year, I found his letters promising to acknowledge me as his daughter and provide for me. All eyes turned to Natasha Volkov, who had remained silent throughout the other stories. She studied each face carefully before speaking. My connection to Ezekiel Morgan is different, she said, her accent more pronounced now. I am not his daughter, not his lover, not his debtor. I am here because of a promise he made to my father before he died. A promise that involves more than money. What kind of promise? Caleb asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Natasha's dark eyes fixed on his. Your grandfather was not always the respectable rancher you knew. In his younger days, he was involved in activities that some might consider questionable. My father helped him escape from certain death in Russia. In return, Ezekiel promised that if my father's family ever needed sanctuary, he would provide it. The room fell silent. Caleb felt as if he were learning about a completely different person than the grandfather who had raised him. Russia, he managed. Grandfather was never in Russia. Your grandfather was in many places, did many things, Natasha replied. The man you knew was only the final chapter of a very long and complicated story. Jake Wheeler, who had been standing quietly in the doorway, stepped forward. Begging your pardon, boss, but we've got trouble. Riders approaching from the south. Looks like maybe a dozen men, and they're armed. Caleb stood quickly, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt .45 on his hip. How far out? Maybe 10 minutes. They're not trying to hide their approach. Catherine Wolfe was already moving toward the window. I see them. Professional gunmen, by the look of them. Someone doesn't want this inheritance settled peacefully. Victoria's voice stopped Caleb as he headed for the door. Caleb, there's something else you need to know. Something I didn't mention earlier. He turned back to her, dreading what new revelation was coming. My mother's letters from Ezekiel, they mention a hidden cache somewhere on this property. Something valuable enough that men might kill for it. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, and Caleb realized that the battle for his inheritance was about to become very real indeed. Underscore 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 underscore. Chapter 3. Blood and Betrayal. The riders came to a halt 50 yards from the main house, their horses snorting and stamping in the evening dust. Caleb counted 13 men, all armed with rifles and wearing the hard expressions of professional gunfighters. At their head rode a man Caleb recognized with a sinking heart, Marcus Dalton, a notorious hired gun who worked for the highest bidder. Morgan. Dalton called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. We need to talk. Caleb stepped onto the porch, his hand resting on his gun butt. Behind him, he could sense the 7 women watching from the windows, and he was acutely aware that Jake Wheeler and 3 other ranch hands had positioned themselves strategically around the property. Dalton, Caleb replied, keeping his voice steady. You're trespassing on private property. The gunfighter laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Private property? That's what we're here to discuss. Seems there's some question about who actually owns this spread. The will is being settled legally. Whatever you've been told, there's no dispute that requires your services. Dalton spurred his horse closer, stopping just outside easy pistol range. See, that's where you're wrong, boy. My employer has a prior claim on this property, one that predates any will. From behind Caleb came Victoria Ashford's voice. Who's your employer, Mr. Dalton? The gunfighter's eyes shifted to the woman standing in the doorway. Well, well, Miss Victoria Ashford, isn't it? Your reputation precedes you, ma'am. My employer prefers to remain anonymous for now, but he's authorized me to make you all an offer. What kind of offer? Caleb asked, though he suspected he wouldn't like the answer. Simple. You all pack up and leave. Tonight. In return, you get to keep breathing. Refuse, and, well, accidents happen on remote ranches. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Caleb felt his anger rising, but before he could respond, Catherine Wolfe stepped onto the porch beside him. 13 men, she observed calmly. Good odds for a massacre, poor odds for a fair fight. Dalton's smile was predatory. The lady knows her business. Smart woman. Maybe you should listen to her. Maybe you should listen to this. Came a new voice from the shadows near the barn. Tom Bradley stepped into view, a Winchester rifle cradled in his arms. This is Morganland, and we protect what's ours. More ranch hands emerged from concealment. Jake Wheeler from behind the water trough. 2 more men from the bunkhouse, another from the corral. They were outnumbered, but they had the advantage of cover and defensive positions. Dalton's expression hardened. You're making a mistake, Morgan. My employer isn't a patient man. Then maybe your employer should come here himself, instead of sending hired killers, Caleb replied. From inside the house came Natasha Volkov's voice, speaking just loud enough to carry. Some debts can only be paid in blood. Dalton's head snapped toward the sound. Who said that? Someone who understands the nature of old debts, Natasha replied, stepping into view. Tell your employer that Ezekiel Morgan's obligations will be honored, all of them. Something in her tone made Dalton's horse sidestep nervously. The gunfighter studied Natasha for a long moment, and Caleb could see uncertainty creeping into his expression. You know who I represent? Dalton asked. I know many things, Natasha replied cryptically, including the fact that your employer's claim is not as strong as he believes. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Then, unexpectedly, Dr. Margaret Hayes stepped forward. Mr. Dalton, she said in her professional voice, I'm a physician. I've seen what bullets do to human bodies. Are you prepared to be responsible for that kind of carnage over a property dispute? Ma'am, with respect, this isn't about property. This is about justice. Whose justice? Isabella Reyes asked, joining the group on the porch. The justice of hired guns and threats? Sarah Mitchell appeared as well, carrying a shotgun with the familiarity of someone who knew how to use it. Where I come from, we settle disputes with law, not lead. Emma Thompson was the last to emerge, her young face pale but determined. If this ranch belonged to my father, then I have as much right to be here as anyone. Dalton looked around at the assembled women and defenders, clearly not having expected this level of unified resistance. You're all making a big mistake. My employer has resources you can't imagine. And we have something he doesn't, Caleb said firmly. We have the law on our side. The law. Dalton laughed harshly. Boy, the nearest sheriff is 2 days' ride from here. A lot can happen in 2 days. Then perhaps came a new voice from the darkness. It's fortunate that the law has come to us. Everyone turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows beyond the corral. The man was tall, wearing a badge that caught the lamplight, and carrying himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Sheriff William Hayes, the newcomer announced. Territorial Marshal. Mr. Dalton, you and your men are trespassing on private property while armed and making threats. I suggest you move along. Dalton's face went through several expressions before settling on frustrated anger. Marshal Hayes, didn't expect to see you out here. I'm sure you didn't, but I make it my business to know when large groups of armed men are riding through my territory. The marshal's hand rested casually on his gun butt, especially when those men work for certain unsavory employers. Dr. Margaret Hayes stepped forward with a smile. Hello, William. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce my brother, Marshal William Hayes. The revelation sent a ripple of surprise through both groups. Caleb realized that Dr. Hayes had been expecting trouble and had somehow arranged for law enforcement to be present. Marshal Hayes addressed Dalton directly. You have two choices. Ride out now, or I'll arrest you and your men for trespassing, making threats, and disturbing the peace. What's it going to be? Dalton's jaw worked silently for several seconds. Finally, he spat in the dust and wheeled his horse around. This isn't over, Morgan. Not by a long shot. Yes, it is, the marshal replied calmly. Any further harassment of these people will be met with the full force of territorial law. As Dalton and his men rode away into the darkness, the tension slowly began to ease. But Caleb knew that the gunfighter's words carried truth. This was far from over. The main room of the Morgan Ranch house had never hosted such a gathering. By lamplight, the 8 heirs and Marshal Hayes sat around the massive oak table while Maria Santos served coffee and tried to make sense of the extraordinary events unfolding. Marshal Hayes spread several documents across the table's surface. What I'm about to tell you will be difficult to hear, but you all deserve the truth about Ezekiel Morgan and why this ranch has become so valuable to certain criminal elements. Caleb leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. Marshal, my grandfather was a respected rancher and businessman. Whatever you think you know. Your grandfather was indeed those things, the marshal interrupted gently. But he was also much more. Margaret, would you like to explain how this investigation began? Dr. Hayes cleared her throat. 6 months ago, I was contacted by a dying man in Denver, a former associate of Ezekiel's from his early days in the territory. He told me that Ezekiel had been involved in recovering stolen Confederate gold at the end of the Civil War. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Confederate gold? Victoria asked. What does that have to do with anything? Marshal Hayes picked up the thread. In 1865, as the Confederacy was collapsing, several shipments of gold were sent west to fund continued resistance. Most of these shipments were intercepted by Union forces, but one, worth approximately $2 million in today's money, simply vanished. And you think my grandfather found it? Caleb's voice was barely above a whisper. We think your grandfather was hired to find it, the marshal replied, by the Union Army. He was working as a scout and tracker at the time, and he had a reputation for being able to find anything in the wilderness. Natasha Volkov spoke for the first time since the confrontation outside. He found it, but he didn't turn it in. All eyes turned to her. How do you know that? Marshal Hayes asked. Because my father was with him when he found it. Dmitry Volkov, former captain in the Russian Imperial Guard, exiled to America for political reasons. He and Ezekiel became partners in several ventures. Catherine Wolfe nodded slowly. That explains the cash Victoria mentioned. Ezekiel always said he had insurance against hard times. The man behind Dalton has been systematically eliminating anyone with knowledge of the gold's location. Marshal Hayes continued grimly. 3 people who worked with Ezekiel in the 1860s have died under suspicious circumstances in the past year. We believe Ezekiel's death may not have been as natural as it appeared. The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. You're saying someone murdered my grandfather? I'm saying it's possible. He was in good health for his age, and his death was very sudden. Unfortunately, by the time we began investigating, it was too late for an autopsy. Natasha's voice cut through the shocked silence. Ezekiel knew he was in danger. That's why he structured his will the way he did. He wanted to ensure that if something happened to him, there would be multiple people with legitimate claims to the property. Harder to eliminate 8 people than 1. He was protecting us, Isabella whispered, even the ones he'd never met. Victoria pulled out her bundle of letters. These mention a golden future and security hidden where only the eagles can see. I assumed he was talking about investments. Eagles, Catherine Wolfe repeated thoughtfully. Ezekiel always said the eagles knew all the secrets of the land. Caleb stood abruptly and walked to the window. There's an eagle's nest on the highest peak of Devil's Canyon. Grandfather used to take me there when I was young. He said it was the best place to see the whole ranch. Devil's Canyon, Jake Wheeler said from the doorway. That's where we found the rustler's tracks, and it's where old Ezekiel used to go when he wanted to think. I think we need to take a look at this canyon, Marshall Hayes decided. But we need to be prepared for trouble. Dalton won't give up easily. Emma Thompson looked nervous. Are we all going? This sounds dangerous. We're stronger together, Sarah Mitchell said firmly. Each of us brings something different to this fight. Then we leave at first light, Caleb decided, and we finish what my grandfather started. The next morning, the group rode toward Devil's Canyon, with Marshall Hayes leading the way. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they climbed higher into the mountains, following ancient game trails that Ezekiel had shown Caleb years before. At the canyon's highest point, they found the eagle's nest Catherine had mentioned. Behind it, hidden by centuries of wind and weather, was a narrow cave entrance that would have been invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. Inside the cave, their torches revealed wooden crates stacked against the walls, crates marked with Confederate insignia and filled with gold coins and bars that had been waiting 20 years to be discovered. $2 million. Marshall Hayes whistled softly. Maybe more. But their moment of triumph was short-lived. The sound of approaching horses echoed from the canyon below, and Caleb realized that Dalton had followed them after all. How many? Catherine asked, moving to the cave entrance. At least a dozen, she reported. They're surrounding the canyon. We're trapped, Emma whispered. No, Natasha said calmly. We're exactly where we need to be. Ezekiel chose this place for a reason. There's another way out. She led them deeper into the cave, where a narrow passage opened onto a hidden trail that wound down the backside of the mountain. One by one, they made their way to safety, carrying what gold they could manage. The confrontation with Dalton's men came at the bottom of the canyon, where Marshall Hayes and his deputies were waiting. The gunfight was brief but decisive, ending with Dalton and his surviving men in custody. 3 months later, the morning sun cast golden light across the Morgan Ranch as Caleb stood on the same porch where his world had changed forever. The Confederate gold had been turned over to the territorial government, earning them a substantial finder's fee that had confirmed their collective ownership of the ranch. But the real treasure, Caleb had come to realize, wasn't the gold at all. The new barn is coming along nicely, Victoria Ashford observed, joining him on the porch. She decided to stay in New Mexico, using her inheritance to establish a school for the children of ranch families throughout the territory. Sarah's design is brilliant, Caleb replied. Sarah Mitchell had used her portion to establish a way station for travelers, built on the southern edge of the ranch property. Dr. Margaret Hayes had opened a medical practice in Santa Fe, but she spent 2 days each week at the ranch, providing health care for the workers and their families. Catherine Wolfe had chosen to stay permanently, serving as head of security and using her tracking skills to expand the cattle operation. Isabella Reyes had purchased the adjacent property for horse breeding, while Emma Thompson managed the ranch's books with remarkable skill for someone so young. Even Natasha Volkov had remained, establishing a consulting business that helped other families resolve complex inheritance disputes. During their weekly family dinner, they toasted Ezekiel Morgan, a man who understood that the greatest treasure wasn't gold, but the people who stand with you when times are hard. Hard to believe it's only been 3 months, Victoria mused. It feels like we've been family for years. Maybe that's what Grandfather intended, Caleb replied. Maybe he knew that the ranch needed more than one person to protect it and help it grow. Caleb had established a trust, ensuring the ranch would remain in their collective family forever, requiring unanimous agreement for major decisions and ensuring future heirs understood the values that brought them together: loyalty, courage, and the willingness to stand together against any threat. The young farmer who thought he was the only heir had discovered something far more valuable than any inheritance. The 7 mysterious women had given him a true family and a legacy that would endure for generations. The Morgan Ranch had become more than property. It was a symbol of what could be accomplished when people with different backgrounds and skills came together for a common purpose. The greatest wealth comes not from what you own, but from the people who choose to stand beside you. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Caleb smiled and headed inside to join his family for the evening. The legacy of Ezekiel Morgan lived on, not in gold or land, but in the bonds of loyalty and love that connected 8 strangers who had become family. If you enjoyed this incredible tale of family, legacy, and the bonds that unite us, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories from the American frontier. Hit that notification bell and let us know in the comments which character was your favorite. Until next time, remember that sometimes the greatest treasures are the ones we never expected to find.